Today's stories may contain content that some viewers may find sensitive, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. I love my night shifts. I've always been a night person, and waking me up before noon is impossible. Therefore, I typically worked third shifts or overnights. Overnights were better because I didn't lose part of my day and typically didn't deal with a lot of customers, so it was a win-win for me. I've done several different odd jobs too that others may not have wanted to, but I wasn't really bothered by much, so I was cool with it. The bigger problem that I tended to have was the people. Part of the reason I worked these jobs was to avoid a lot of them, but the people I did come across were always so far out there and just kind of creepy. And I've got plenty to share. One of the earlier jobs that I did was working at the bookstore at the college that I attended. It was pretty cool because you could put part or all of the money you made towards your tuition, which helped cover some of the costs. I also loved it because I'm an avid reader, so I was in there reading all night with other students that were like me. I all just wanted to be left alone. Perfect, right? However, it is a college town, and it's quite a popular one, so we would get the typical drunks roaming the streets out front. And we could typically get them to leave with little confrontation, but sometimes others took authorities, but still nothing too crazy. Except for this one guy that came by, that still freaks me out thinking about it. So, the bookstore also has a small cafe attached to it, and a lounge area kind of carved out on one side of the wall. It was like a cozy sunroom that you could sit in and read and study. Even when I was working, I would sit over there if no one else was. This one ordinary night, I was in the store putting back the rentals when I saw a guy walking by the window where the sunroom was at. There were a few streetlights and ones along the campus, so I could clearly see that someone was there. I just saw him in my peripheral as he passed by, but then I saw him going backwards by the window again. And when I say going backwards, I mean it was like I was seeing him rewind. He was walking backwards, but his motions weren't natural. This, of course, got me to look over at him. He stopped at the window and was just staring, so I looked over at him to see if he would do or say something. Occasionally, people would just stop and look in for a bit and then move on, but this guy became fixated on something. I tried turning around to follow his line of sight, but the only thing I could see in his direction was a motivational poster and a lamp. There was a desk with a stack of books, but I doubt that he could read them from that distance. So I turned back around to look at him, and he was still staring. I tapped on the window to possibly get his attention, but that did nothing. He didn't move. He didn't change his stare or even acknowledge me. I stared back at him, waiting to see what would happen next, and that's when I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. This guy's face was drained of all color. He looked gray, and his face kind of looked like it was melting. I want to say it looked like it was drooping, but it wasn't like that. It kind of looked like it was just going to fall off. His eyes were the worst part. They looked cloudy and lifeless. He didn't look old either. There are those people that just don't take care of themselves, and they end up looking a lot older than they actually are. And that's kind of what I got from this guy. Maybe he was under the influence, though, and maybe that was why, but as mentioned, I've seen my share of addicts and drunks, and this just did not look like that. So, as I continued to watch, He stood still, minus a slight sway, staring up in the corner. After some time, I decided to continue my work, thinking and hoping that he would eventually walk off. But every few minutes, I would look over and he would still be there. I walked back behind the counter and sat there for the remainder of the shift because he was still there. He stood there for 2 more hours just staring. I was pretty good friends with the campus security guard that was working that night, and he usually stopped by the store before we left, so I called him from the store phone asking him to walk me out, just because of this guy. I didn't know if he would do anything when we tried to leave, so I wanted someone there with me. So when Brian got there, he immediately saw the guy and didn't feel comfortable about it either. He wanted to call someone about it, but I figured he wasn't really doing anything, so they probably wouldn't care too much about it anyways. He agreed, and I finished closing stuff and then locked up. Right before I closed the gate and turned the light off, I looked over and the guy was still there. Now, to leave, you had to walk to the left of the store where the entrance was. There was a solid wall there for the store, and the other wall had glass displays of awards, and in between was the swinging doors to enter. As we left the building, I stepped forward hesitantly, expecting to see this guy, but he was just gone. There were no signs of him. I walked over by the window to see if there was anything there, but there was nothing. There was nothing on the ground, nothing on the glass, and the building was pretty long, so he wouldn't have had time to get out of view, as it was a straight path down. Even if he was running, I feel like we would have been able to see him. I didn't even see a car nearby that could have picked him up. He literally just vanished. And after that night, I never saw him again. And neither did anyone else claim that they ever saw him. Another job that I worked at was with the sterilization team. We went in late at night, typically overnight, and cleaned places like restaurants, grocery stores, and even some hotels. It was actually a friend of mine that worked there and got me to apply at the time. Again, it wasn't too bad. That one I never dealt with customers, so it was headphones in at all times and just cleaning. We typically didn't get anything too serious or gross, but sometimes the hotel rooms were questionable. Again, people are creepy and disgusting, but surprisingly, this one isn't about a person. It still is very strange, though. There was one restaurant that we cleaned on a weekly basis. It was a local chain, and the owner was very strict about how he wanted the place cleaned and organized. Once we finished the cleaning, we had to make sure that everything was put up in a specific manner. Otherwise, he would just complain. For example, the chairs had to be stacked in one spot specifically. The chairs were not to be put on the tables, even if they were completely cleaned or upside down. We had to use a specific cleaner because he thought the standard one we used was too abrasive, and it would take the coating off of the tables. That kind of stuff. So it probably took us the longest because of the specifics we had to follow, but overall still not too big of a deal though. So when a radio would come on randomly in the restaurant, I first just thought it was something the owner set up to come on, and maybe just set it for the wrong time. It was 1:23 a.m. when it would go off, but it was never an alarm sound or a specific song or anything, but really just static. I could hear it over my headphones, and it actually startled me the first time. I went to find the source when I found one of those old antenna and dial radios that plugged in, or took those giant batteries. It looked ancient, and it stuck out with the very modern look of this place. However, it was back in the kitchen, so then I just assumed someone probably brought it in to have something to listen to. Maybe. Either way, I walked up to it and turned it off and then moved on with my night. Then the next week rolled around, and as we cleaned, 1:23 a.m. rolled around and it went off again. I went back to it to turn it off, and that's when I realized there was no way to set some kind of alarm on this dinosaur of a radio. It was literally just an on-off switch, a tuner dial, and a switch to change from AM to FM. So, again, I just turned it off and moved on, thinking maybe it had some kind of short, and then I forgot about it. But then, it happened thrice, at the same time. Curious, and maybe a little annoyed, I inspected it a little more. I noticed it was on FM, and the dial was actually on a station that I listened to frequently. It was some alternative rock station. Maybe it went down at some point for some reason. I don't know if radio stations ever have to reboot or do maintenance or something to that effect, but that was my initial thought. However, while I was looking at this thing more, I noticed it wasn't just static. It was faint, but I could hear people, or at least one person, talking. I tried to listen closer to make out what they were saying, but it was so quiet that turning it up only made the static louder, so I really couldn't decipher anything. I wanted to mess with the dials some, but I'd been called for and knew that I needed to get back to work, so I just unplugged it and walked off. Thankfully, I guess, it happened again, but this week we actually had an extra person with us, so the cleaning was getting done quicker than normal. I decided to take my last break a little earlier so I could go mess around with that radio again, and I walked in a little before 1:23, and I watched as it clicked on and the static started. That was the one that actually spooked me a bit. I felt like I was in some dumb, scary movie, and there was going to be a ghost behind me. This time, however, I brought my old MP3 player that I had because you could listen to the radio on it, so I thought I would try going to the same station. And to my surprise, it was just actually playing music. There was no static, just a clear station. I even tried going to the numbers in between that one and the next station, but I could not replicate it on my device. So I again held it to my ear and tried to listen to what I was hearing. This time, I could make out a few words and phrases. I got listen, becoming, execution, right of way, being, or beings. Those are the ones that I can remember. The guy sounded angry, though. Maybe it was the way it was coming through, but he reminded me of my dad, giving a stern talking, but this guy sounded like he was slowly becoming more and more enraged. And to add to it, I tried changing it to the AM stations, and it didn't change. I changed it back between the two, and the static was, well, static. And the talking didn't sound any clearer or any worse. The only thing that would change it or stop it was unplugging it. But this time, I wanted to see how long it would go and if it would even turn itself off before we left. So I went ahead and turned it down a bit, and I waited as I did some of the last cleaning bits in the kitchen. To my surprise, and after delaying some, it did turn off at 1:46 a.m. It was on for exactly 23 minutes. Anyone know of any significance to that number? Anyways, we left for the night with nothing else weird happening. I was pretty invested though, so I agreed to return to listen to the mystery radio for the 5th time. But beforehand, I did try to replicate the station again at home. I tried in my car and my stereo in my room, but no luck. I tried all the stations in between, and I even spent way too long on the AM ones, but found nothing matching that guy's voice. It actually did happen again, right on schedule, but this time, I told my friends, since they were on the same shift with me, to come and check it out. I told them what had been happening, and they found it even more interesting, because they'd cleaned here before, and they said that that had never occurred. I told them it's been doing it every time that I've been here. The kicker to this was the following 2 weeks. I didn't go there because I was sick one day, and I had called in on the other, and I was scheduled off. However, both of those days, my friend did work it, and they said that it never happened. Then I went back, and it happened again, like clockwork. So now I feel like I'm being used as a channel or a conduit of some sort for something to reach out. It's a weird feeling. I never really thought about that kind of stuff before until that moment. I didn't stay at that job though, because they started cleaning a little more risky things like crime scenes, and that I wasn't personally comfortable with, so I left. But I still listened to some of the creepy stories with my friends. I tried looking into the radio, the station, the time, and even paranormal occurrences to see if there was any correlation that could possibly connect it, but the most I found was that the owner had a kid that died at a young age, and the date of his death was January 23rd. It may just be a coincidence, but I thought it was weird. And even if it was related, what significance does the angry guy with his words have? Does anyone have any suggestions on what I should look into? I don't want to give too much information out about the restaurant, or the company, especially since they do more legal services now, but I'm still very curious, if not a bit creeped out by this occurrence. Maybe it's just me, though. Maybe I attract strange and bizarre people and things. Way back in the early 2000s, I used to have the nerdiest and probably most boring IT job one could ever have. I was contracted out to work as the overnight IT guy for a group of car dealerships in my downtown area. All of the dealerships were owned by the same people, and they were all a combination of the person's name and the type of car, so think something like Carlin's Chevrolet and Carlin's Mercedes. Not hugely relevant, but it helps you to understand that this was basically a very lucrative business for the owner, and they had quite a bit of money. That said, for whatever reason, the owner and head of technology for the dealership group was adamantly against using modern technology for backing things up. And every single thing that the company did that was digital was put onto a magnetic tape drive. Most people born after the turn of the millennium probably won't even know what that is. And just for them, it's literally a cartridge-like device that plugs into the server rack, and the data is written to it like a disk. But it's magnetic, and it's actually a tape. I know that that was a poor attempt at explaining what they are, but what it is isn't hugely relevant to the story. I just wanted to highlight that this place was incredibly retro with their technologies, though tape drives are actually pretty prominent in IT nowadays. Being the overnight IT guy was, as I said, probably the most boring job in the world. The entire job was just me going to one of the dealerships, walking into the server closet, and running the backup system to run to the magnetic tapes. Because their back-end system was antiquated, and every backup was required to be a full backup, I would start it at around 10 p.m., and everything would be done and verified by around 7 in the morning. Because they wanted the most value for their money, I would have to start the backup, and then would be expected to answer any support tickets that came in, or were pre-assigned for the dealership that I was at. This would oftentimes lead to me having to wander around the dark and empty dealership to find the system, printer, or whatever wasn't working properly, and stay in that spot until the issue was fixed. This is when things would typically get creepy. We weren't supposed to disturb the dealership or turn on the main lights, all requests and requirements from the owner, so we had to navigate the place by flashlight, and whatever backup lights happened to be on. Now, before I get into some of the creepiness that occurred during my work, I just want you all to visualize what every night was for me. My night started in a nice, bright, open server closet, and I would have to walk into a big, pitch black and open building for the rest of the night. If you've ever seen the inside of a service department for a dealership, you know that it's basically like a big, empty warehouse. I had to walk around this with a flashlight to try and locate a single computer or a printer. I know I'm repeating things, but it was creepy as hell. It was like walking around an abandoned building level of creepy. As stated, there were several incidents that made me regret ever coming to work, some unexplainable and some pretty well grounded in our reality. The first situation that I wanted to mention happened one night when I had a help ticket for one of the technician's machines. I don't remember the reported issue, but it was something simple like, the computer won't turn on. I grab what I need for the limited diagnostics that I could do on the computer in the dark, and headed out onto the service floor, looking for which system I was supposed to be working on. I remember on this ticket, I was actually pretty thankful for the tech because he had the wherewithal to put a piece of paper over the screen that said broken, which made it pretty obvious which one I needed to fix. I went over to the computer and checked all the connections to make sure that they were fitted well, unplugged, replugged, tested the outlet. The outlet checked out fine, the cable worked on my diagnostics machines, so I determined that the issue was just the power supply for the computer, which then meant that I had to carry it out to the truck and get a replacement set up. Not a huge deal, just tedious as I had to disconnect everything from the tower and then carry it outside. These things were pretty old, and they were designed to take a beating, so they were fairly heavy and bulky. So I was getting the system disconnected and moving things to pull it off of the stand when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the back end of the service floor. The area in the back was designated for the details team, basically the guys that got the cars that were for sale and cleaned them to look as shiny and appealing as they could. I shined my flashlight to the back for a moment to see if there was someone back there, but when I looked, there wasn't anyone there. I shrugged it off and just assumed that I was hearing things, but then I heard the footsteps again. I quickly lifted my lights to look, and I swear that I saw a vague outline of a person walking behind one of the walls that cut off the break room. Obviously, there wasn't supposed to be anyone here, so I was a bit concerned and confused. But ultimately, my curiosity and thoughts of, I should really go see who that is, got the best of me, and I walked away to go look. When I got to the back, I didn't see any trace of anyone, or anything that looked like it would indicate someone was there. And then I looked over and noticed that the break room light was on, so I again just assumed that they went to the break room. I pulled the door open and started in with, "Just so you know, you scared the hell out of me," but stopped mid-sentence when I realized the room was empty. There was nobody there. No detail guys, no techs, no intruders. Just nobody. The room was completely and totally still, and honestly, it was cold as hell. As someone that had a firm belief in all things paranormal, I noped out of there as quickly as I could. I left the light on, shut the door, and just told myself that I would finish the work for the ticket and spend the rest of that night in the server room. And that wasn't quite the end of it, though. I took the old computer out to the truck and got them the replacement system, but I had to leave my diagnostic system and other items on the tech's desk as I took it out. When I got back onto the floor with the new system and started back toward the desk, my work system and my tools were on the floor, scattered. The diagnostic system looked like it had been thrown onto the concrete. And I mean thrown hard. The case on it was bent, the tools and wires were scattered around it, and it was pretty clearly damaged. I just shook my head, called myself clumsy and was unwilling to admit that whatever happened was the doing of something paranormal. I got that new system set up and ready in literal record time. Probably a record for the entire IT crew, honestly, and I ran my happy behind back to the server closet and just kind of sat there. The other story that I'm wanting to mention is kind of similar, but ended in a completely different way. I was a bit more seasoned in my work for the dealerships. At this point, I think I'd been working there for 5 or so years, and I'd experienced quite a bit of weird things. Mostly paranormal or just weird, and that does include the support tickets. That said, this was probably one of the scariest things that had happened while I was working there, mostly because it could have gone horribly. Like the previously described night, I was running my backups and had a support ticket for one of the service computers down on the floor. It was a network issue, which was typically just a bad cable, so I really didn't think much of it. I grabbed my Ethernet cables and testing tools just in case, and walked down to the darkness to fix the system. As I'm sitting there, replacing the cable, I heard what sounded like the door being hit or kicked, but I really wasn't 100% sure what it was. Like most nights, I decided to simply ignore it and say it was nothing important. But unlike most nights, the banging was followed up by the glass on the door shattering. As soon as I heard that, I knew that someone was breaking into the dealership, and I immediately jumped into fight or flight mode. At first I was thinking, I need to confront these people and scare them off. But then it occurred to me that I was a scrawny guy in his mid-30s with nothing more than an Ethernet cable to defend myself, and I decided that that would have been a very dumb idea. I ran as quickly as I could to get behind one of the half walls that blocked the main floor from some of the machines, and I think I literally crawled underneath one of them. I just remember sitting there and thinking that if these guys found me, I was going to die. No doubt about it. The other part of this situation was me trying to figure out why they would break into a service department of a car dealership. Then, I heard what sounded like more glass shattering, and then more. Whoever this was, it seemed like they were going around to all of the customer cars that were in the bays and shattering the windows. After what felt like forever of them smashing windows, they stopped for a few moments and then proceeded to start trashing the toolboxes and throwing things in all directions. I just stayed there where I was, under what I believed to be a rotor turning machine, and tried my best not to breathe. After a little bit, it seemed like whoever it was had trashed the entire service floor, and I could hear them breathing heavily, and then it sounded like they had just left. I think I stayed hidden for around 20 more minutes before I literally moved at all, and then took another 5 or so to just stand up and see what the hell had happened. The service floor was a disaster. I was right in my initial guess. Whoever this was had smashed every window on each car on the floor, and it looked like they had gone through every single toolbox and just trashed everything. As soon as I was certain that the person was gone, I made a mad dash up to the main floor and grabbed one of the phones to call my boss. I told him what had happened, and he told me to call the police. He said he would notify the dealership's owner, and then I did as he said. I called the cops. I waited for them outside of the door and explained the whole thing to them when they got there. Then I had to re-explain it because they were a bit confused on why I was there and what the hell had happened. My boss and the owner showed up at about the same time, and then I explained to them with the police there and showed them the service floor. I think the cops were confused or suspicious of me, but the owner vouched for me, telling them that I was a contractor and had worked for them for a long time, and that if I said it happened the way it did, then that's how it happened. And thankfully, and much to my surprise, They actually had decent cameras in the service area that saw everything. And it actually did happen like I had said it did. The guy broke the glass on the door, walked around and smashed as much as he could, and then he trashed the place. All without taking anything or looking like he had any direction other than destruction. I remember having to sit with the owner as he made a note of everything and everyone that he needed to contact in the morning. And I recall him doing the math and saying that the amount of damage this guy had caused was insane. Apparently, this guy was actually a tech that had worked for the dealership, but had been fired about a week or so prior to the incident. I was told that he was caught stealing from a customer's car and another tech by the exact same cameras that caught him smashing the windows. Apparently, this was him getting revenge, or sticking it to the dealership for firing him. Obviously, he was arrested and charged once they could prove that it was him. The customer cars all got repaired for free, and the techs that still had their jobs all got new tools. So I guess that's a silver lining to what happened, right? So these are just two of the incidents, and probably the two that stick out the most in my mind from my time working there. I don't work there anymore, at least not out in the field. I'm more of a desk worker for the same company now, and manage a small team of field techs. Thankfully, none of them have had to call me with anything anywhere near this exciting. And before you ask, yes, they still use magnetic tapes. Back in the 90s, I worked at a small local sporting goods store. It was decent sized, but far from the ones like today. You know the ones. I worked there when I was younger because it was super laid back, and for the time I made decent money as a teenager. I was one of the stocking associates, so I would help open boxes, fill shelves, organize things like that. There were a lot of older folks that worked there too, so it was easier to have us younger kids doing the heavy lifting. While it was a job, I did still have fun with it though, as I was pretty athletic. I loved baseball, and I played on my high school team as well as swimming, but I also liked hiking and hunting too. So, when we got new supplies, it was almost like Christmas, as I went through the items. I checked what they did, tried them out, if they weren't in packaging, of course. The even better part about it all was that I worked the later shift, like 4 p.m. to midnight, because again, the older employees didn't want to work that late. Now, there aren't a lot of people buying golf clubs and camping gear at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, so most of us just fooled around in the store with the supplies, or just read magazines from the front. My boss, Rick, at the time, was also really cool about it. He typically stayed in his office after 8 or 9 and would come out occasionally to ask us to do something, or just to check on us. But since he trusted us, we were pretty much left to our own devices. I liked checking out the camping equipment myself, since I often went with my dad. We had a few full-size tents set up on a wide metal shelf-like awning. One of them I wanted to save up for because I thought it would be really convenient for us. It was a little longer and had a separator in the center, so it made it look like it was 2 separate rooms. I think it was to be used more like a mudroom, or maybe to hold your belongings, so that they didn't take up so much space where you slept, but I thought it would work for us since I got mine from a thrift store, and it hardly zipped up. That way, we could share one, or just have an extra place for our stuff, and know that it was secure. We also sold guns and ammo at the time, so I was always telling my dad what we had and when we would get new items. These were just some of the few things I did in our downtime, but don't worry, as it is all relevant to the story. So, one of the other perks of working the late shift is doing inventory. The thing is, it was the 90s, so we did most of it by hand. This also went overnight, so most of us took turns on that shift. I didn't mind doing it, but if I had a choice, I wouldn't have. Sometimes it was good, but other times were a struggle depending on what was going on the day before, or even who I worked with. You know the type. The ones that complain about everything, never stop talking, they have a million problems. Call me whatever, but it can make a shift drag. So it was my turn to do inventory, and I was working with Ed, Casey, and Laura. We did it by department to make sure that we covered each part and did it correctly, with 2 of us in one department at a time. As we made our way around the store, we got to the camping equipment. The tents that were on display weren't part of the inventory count, so normally I wouldn't even have given them a second glance. But I saw a backpack sitting next to one of them. When I grabbed it, it felt heavy, and I also didn't see any tags on it like it was one of ours. So I just assumed that someone had left their bag there. I stopped to bring it to the front to show Rick, and with him standing there, he suggested that I open it to see if there was any identification in it. There were no IDs or wallets in it, but plenty of small food items, like jerky, chips, candy bars, similar to the impulse items, and some other random things like a pocket knife, toilet paper, and a towel. We all thought that maybe whomever it was planning on stealing stuff, but got spooked and just decided to ditch the bag. Some of the items could have been from our store, but we had no way of knowing for sure. So Rick took the bag, and we put it in his office as we continued on as normal. We noticed a few other items in the camping supplies and other departments toward the back that seemed out of place too. One of the things we noticed was a stepladder that employees used to get stuff off the top shelves for customers, or for stocking stuff in the back, and it was sitting in the middle of an aisle. Of course, that being a safety hazard, I asked on the walkie if anyone was using it, or who left it out, and no one said that they had used it. I was annoyed at first because either someone was lying or someone from the day crew left it out, but I just took it to the back and moved on. After several long hours, we finally finished the inventory at around 4 in the morning. We were delayed a few times due to unrelated situations, and maybe a few of us slacking off, but we did get it done. The store was going to be opening at 8 that morning, and I was scheduled to work later that evening, so I was pretty ready to leave. We did a final walkthrough to make sure all the lights were off and things were locked up. As I mentioned, this was back in the 90s, so our systems were pretty simple, lock and key style security. Hell, we only had cameras at the door and registers. Most of the security we had in the store was motion sensor lights. When we turned off the main lights, we had the 2 towards the sides that were always on, and the others kicked on only if there was motion. So after turning off the lights, we all walked to the front to get ready to leave, and Rick pointed to the back mentioning that a light was on. I poked fun at one of the girls because they were supposed to turn it off, and they told me that they did. So I just walked back to the office to turn it off, when I noticed it was actually off. Since that meant that motion set it off, I went back and told Rick, and I remember we all stood there thinking out loud, what could have set it off? Did something fall off a shelf? Maybe the AC caused something to shift or move and caused it to flick on? But Rick was more than ready to go home and sleep in a bed instead of an office chair, and just said not to worry about it. So we all started to head out. And we all got outside into our cars when I realized that I couldn't find my keys. It was like I was meant to stay there until my next shift with how things were going. It was 4 in the morning after all, so I'm sure my mind wasn't all there, and I just forgot to grab them from my locker. So I had to quickly flag down Rick before he left. Thankfully, I caught him and he handed me the keys to go in and get them. I ran up to the store, unlocked it and walked in, and began to run towards the back when I noticed again that the light in the camping gear had kicked on. I tried to ignore it as I went to get my keys, but when I came back, I heard something that sounded like falling. I couldn't not check it out at this point. I swiftly walked over to it and again saw the stepladder sitting by the tent shelf, knocked over on its side. Now, this time, I knew for a fact that I had put the ladder up, so I was confused and cautious about what to do next. As I stood there staring down the aisle, I started hearing what sounded like someone very quietly talking to themselves, or whispering very softly. I couldn't make out any of the words, but I could definitely tell that it was there. I either had the choice of walking to the front and calling 911, leaving, or attempting to confront whatever it was. I was young and naive, but I thought I could definitely handle whatever it was and decided to proceed. I walked up to the stepladder, and I looked around to see the tent slightly moving. Since you had to use the stepladder to get closer to it, I moved it to the side, and in the most threatening voice that I could muster, I yelled at the person to show themselves. After what felt like forever, whoever was in there stopped moving, slowly unzipped the tent, and tried to quickly jump out of it. I think they thought that they could make the jump, but quickly stumbled into the shelf in front of us, knocking it over. He quickly ran off, and I took chase, as he ran to the employee back room. As I ran around the corner, I heard a familiar voice shout out for me, and I turned around to see Rick running towards me. I tried to explain to him what had happened, when he told me to go call 911 while he stood at the doors. There was only one exit in the back, and that was an emergency exit, but it was locked when we were closed, so if he was going to get out, he would have to come back to where Rick was now standing. I went and called 911, and while I was on the phone with them, I could hear shouting. Once I finished, I set the phone down like the operator told me to, and I ran out to check on Rick to see him wrestling someone to the ground. So, to not turn this into a pay-per-view match, the cops showed up and restrained the guy as we gave our side of things. The guy looked normal for the most part. He had decent-looking clothes on, he had a buzz cut and a short beard, and he seemed pretty coherent. What we learned, though, was he looked clean because he had taken some of the hunting clothes that we sold. He was wearing a pair of camo pants and a fisherman's shirt. His clothes and some of his claimed belongings were in the tent, including a razor, some soap, and a few things of food. We also learned that the backpack was his, and he admitted that he had taken some items from the store. This man had been living in that tent for a few weeks now. He came in at some point during the day and knew where to stay hidden until we closed up. However, he didn't realize that we were going to be there late doing the inventory, so we had to quickly scramble to get in the tent and forgot to grab his backpack. I've thought about it on occasions because the guy had a knife in the backpack as well. If he'd had it, would he have attempted to use it on one of us? And something even more startling to me was, I had never seen this guy before. We had regulars, and I regularly saw people come and go, but for 2 weeks, this guy was here daily and I never saw him. It was honestly kind of bizarre. It definitely made me more aware of my surroundings, but I always remember this, and I do play different scenarios in my head about what could have happened. Alrighty, so that was a collection of 3 night shift stories. 3 creepy stories that happened on the overnight shifts, the shifts that happened overnight. Yep, anyways, this collection was actually the winner of a poll that I ran back in March, I believe, for the last video of April. The options, I don't remember them, but I know one of them was night shift stories because it won. I ran a similar poll for May, last week or a week or so, for the last video in May. I already said May. Anyways, for hotel, pizza delivery, neighbor, or Uber, and the creepy neighbor stories actually won that poll. So look for that on May 27th, which is a bit away, but, anyways. And then probably middle of May, I will do another poll for June's stories. I kind of like doing these polls to see what you guys want. Hopefully this video does well because it was the winning vote. If it doesn't do well, you only have yourselves to blame. I'm joking. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you really liked what you heard, could you leave me a comment letting me know what you thought down below? It helps the video get pushed harder the more interaction it gets. And yeah. I do apologize that I'm still sounding a bit bleh. I'm not feeling the best still. Throat is still really dry and scratchy. I think that's going to be the truth of it for probably a little bit. Just a little bit more, a little longer. Hopefully not, but you never know. Yeah. And not much else to say. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you have a beautiful weekend. And I hope I do see you on the next video. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, and you are the best you that you could possibly be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And of course, my friends, sleep well.